Good morning, I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily update for December 20th, 2021. Today I'm going to present you with a very sober and serious message coming from the Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Grushko, which was delivered on Saturday in response to the seeming neglect coming from NATO in response to the initiatives taken by Putin and the Russians to de-escalate around Ukraine. What Putin had proposed in the discussion with Biden in their summit, and then the Russians drafted an agreement which they wished the West to consider, and actually intended for the West to take up, is that there would be no NATO membership for Ukraine, no further extension eastward, no delivery of offensive weapon systems to Ukraine, and a commitment from the West to pressure the Kiev government to negotiate and act in good faith on the agreements they signed from the Minsk Accord to settle the situation in eastern Ukraine. So far, it appears the United States response is no, no, no. You don't enforce red lines on us. And the reason for this is, are they crazy? I mean, the only thing you can conclude is that the leaders of the United States and NATO are on a death march for humanity by their insistence that Russia is preparing an invasion of Ukraine, and therefore the West must build up the weapon systems in Ukraine and be prepared for war. Now, it's in that context that I'm going to present you the statement from Grushko, which is not covered in the American press, so far as I can tell. We're getting only the Warhawk Propaganda against Russia, the neocons who are insisting that 20 years of war in Afghanistan is not enough. They need more wars to justify their bloated defense budget, but also to continue to develop the image of an enemy for us to mobilize against while they actually are engaging in actions against the people of the Western nations. What Grushko said is, the moment of truth has come. He said, we have reached our red line. The proposals that were made by Russia, quote, aim to pull us away from this red line and start a normal dialogue, unquote. And again, as I said, no NATO membership for Ukraine, no offensive weapons buildup, and pressure for Ukraine to stick to the Minsk Accords. He went on to say that these are security guarantees. And he said, instead, NATO is in a fantasy world based on the need to have a perceived threat from the East to justify its continued existence. And the Russians are explicitly concerned about the idea of offensive weapons being placed on the border of Russia by NATO that are minutes away from Moscow, and that if launched would leave very little time for a decision to respond with a counterstrike. Now let's go back to 1962 for a moment and the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I don't think the people who are pushing this policy in the West have given any thought to how close we came to nuclear war in October 1962, when the U.S. detected an arms buildup with nuclear missiles being placed in Cuba, 90 miles from Florida, and within distance, the easy distance of Washington. On October 22nd, President Kennedy delivered an address to the nation, this is 1962, to explain why he enacted a naval quarantine to keep more missiles and equipment from being delivered. He said the U.S. will not allow offensive weapons to be delivered to Cuba. Then he demanded that the weapons and equipment already there be removed and taken back to the Soviet Union. For the moment, the question of war and peace hung in the balance as Russian ships approached the quarantine line, but then turned back. And at the same time, there was an intense back channel of discussion, which was open to assure that there could be some actual dialogue. And Kennedy, as is clear from other memos and reports from his associates, intended to pursue a dialogue with the Russians to avoid this kind of situation from happening again. And as a result, on November 20th, the naval quarantine ended and the threat of nuclear war was removed. In his television address, he made the following points. He said, "The transformation of Cuba into an important strategic base constitutes an explicit threat to the peace and security of all the Americas." Well, why would making Ukraine into a strategic base against Russia not be conceived as a threat by the Russians? He went on to say, "Neither the U.S. nor the world community of nations can tolerate deliberate deception and offensive threats on the part of any nation." He described the buildup of the missiles, quote, "in an area well known to have a special and historical relationship to the U.S., is a deliberately provocative and unjustified change in the status quo which cannot be accepted by this country," unquote. That statement could have been made by President Putin in reference to turning Ukraine into an aircraft carrier with the potential to launch offensive weapons, including nuclear strikes, into Russia. Now, that's something people have to consider when you look at the buildup in the media. You look at what's going on in the think tanks, the Atlantic Council, Chatham House, which is British intelligence, the Council on Foreign Relations, comments like Senator Wicker, the Mississippi senator in the U.S. Senate, saying that we should be prepared, if necessary, for a first strike nuclear attack on Russia. These are the kinds of statements and actions, including confrontations in the Black Sea, including near collisions in airspace near the borders, including NATO troops being deployed into Poland and the Baltic states on the Russian borders. This is not Russia doing something wrong. Russia is there. Their actions, their military mobilizations are inside Russia, whereas the U.S. and NATO are pushing troops forward to the very border of Russia. And just think about what Kennedy said. He said that they cannot tolerate offensive threats on the part of any nation. That's why he launched the naval quarantine, which put us on the brink of war. Now, Joe Biden is no Kennedy. Joe Biden and his advisors are not thinking about the security of the future. It's not clear what Joe Biden's thinking about. But you do have people in the military and the military-industrial complex who are committed to a provocative confrontation with Russia in the expectation that Russia will back down. It appears that Putin is not is serious and should not be taken lightly, these threats from Russia, because the Russians see the deployment of the United States and NATO as threats against their country. And as Putin always references, you have to remember that Russia lost 25 to 30 million people in World War II, and they're not about to have that happen again. So it's in this context that people should take seriously this threat coming from Russia. It's not a threat from Russia. It's a response to a threat coming from NATO and the United States. And we have to demand that there be dialogue, that there be discussion, there be more meetings like the one that took place on December 7th on the video conference between Putin and Biden, and that there be more deliberation. Without that, we're on a very short course toward war. And to those of you who say we'll never have a nuclear war, it won't happen. Before World War I, most leaders thought that the mobilization of troops going on between Austria, Germany, and Russia did not mean a war was likely. That's why a book was written called Sleepwalking into War. The same thing is happening today. Miscalculation is very often what leads to war. And if the United States thinks that Putin is just flexing his muscles and showing off because Russia's in trouble and continues to push, then we may be sleepwalking into a nuclear war. So thanks for joining me. I will be posting a link with this morning update to the speech delivered by President Kennedy on October 22nd, 1962, for you to listen to and think about in the context of the present crisis.